Andy, thank you so much for taking some time to be here and chat with me, us, for a little bit. So we're in the first of three seminars all around faith formation in the secular age that we find ourselves in. And, well, you've written the book. So we thought we might ask you some questions. And first of all, can you describe some of the broad strokes of just what our secular age is?
Yeah, it's a great question because I think if we were all in the room together and we were to say, do you think faith formation is difficult because we're in a secular age? We would all probably say, oh yeah, and we would agree on that. But if we started to tease out what we meant by secular, it would probably show some differences. And so you said I wrote the book, which is very kind of you to say, but really who wrote the book on our secular age? There's many projects, obviously, but one of the most substantial ones is Charles Taylor's work. And what Taylor is really trying to do in this really thick 700-page book is get clear on what we really mean when we say, for instance, that the West has slid into a secular age, or the West finds itself in a secular age. And he thinks that the secular really is a multivalent word, that there's multiple different meanings to it. And depending on where your society is at, it takes different forms. So this is where these things come up called secular 1, secular 2, and secular 3, that he kind of gets at defining it, which kind of sounds, I mean, to me, it sounds really cool to think, is that secular 1 or is that secular 2? But it also can be confusing. So, I mean, one of the contributions I've tried to make is that, and Taylor does this himself, but there's also kind of a secular 0 kind of perspective of to think about a world without the secular, which is pretty hard for us modern people to do. But, you know, it doesn't take us much to think back of, you know, just a time before modernity. You can think of London, or think of Paris, and, you know, the 12th or 13th or 14th century. And those really were societies where the secular didn't exist. And really, to be a citizen of London, or to be a citizen of Paris, particularly before the Reformation, you had to go to mass. You had to participate in religious life. And even the way you would talk, the way you would dress, in many ways would continue the liturgy outside of the mass, outside of church. So in some sense, one of the ways I talk about this is that faith formation was quite easy in a secular 0 world. You know, that the whole society formed faith, and it was really hard to be a member of that society and not believe and not have a certain kind of faith commitment. And it's really hard for us to get our mind around this. And the example I always use to kind of think, well, what would that look like today? Is the only one I have is a good TV example, which is The Handmaid's Tale. I don't know if people have seen it there, and it's been running in the UK, but this very kind of scary apocalyptic show of it's written by a Canadian author, which this is my common joke, but it just feels like such a Canadian fantasy because America has fallen and it no longer exists. Well, actually, it still exists, but it exists as a little teeny enclave in Toronto. So that just seems like the ultimate of Canadian dreams. But America has fallen to like this really hyperly right-wing religious group. It's been renamed Gilead. And then, of course, it's this apocalyptic place where everyone is, the whole order of society really is the liturgy, is really this really conservative religious perspective. So faith formation is just clearly happens across the society, and the way you talk, the way you dress, all manifests itself in this. But Taylor's point is, obviously we don't live in that kind of age. We live in a secular age, as opposed to an age where faith and belief were necessities to live in society. So he says the first thing that arises, we end up living in what he calls a secular 1 world. And without getting too weird and complicated, a way to think about this is a divide between the public and the private, where in a secular 0 world, you couldn't trust the landed class, you couldn't trust the king or the queen if they weren't believing people. You'd fear that the devil would take over the realm if that happened. Well, now in a secular 1 world, you could have people running certain institutional structures within society, and they wouldn't have to believe, or they could believe. That didn't really matter, because religion and faith and belief itself became a real private thing. So it was something that had happened privately. Now, the way to think about this, which I think is really interesting, since we are talking across countries here, is that you could make an argument, and I think it's the right argument, that you could make this statement, that America is the most secular country in all the Western countries. Now, you could make that statement, but you could only make it in a secular one context. That when it comes to secular one, the divide between the institutional structures of belief, that America has this very strong inner constitution, separation of church and state. And since the revolution, there has been this huge divide between church and state. So it's very much a secular one country. But that leads us into what Taylor calls secular two. And secular two is, I think, the way most of us tend to think of secular. And secular two is that fewer and fewer people are going to church, that they are making their own kind of willful choice to participate in religious communities at it just less, that the numbers of people going to church are going down. Now, what's interesting about my first statement, that you could say America is the most secular one country, like I said, you could only say that you could only say that it's the most secular country in a secular one sense, because I think because it's the most secular one country, it happens to be the least secular two country. That more people go to church in America than go to church, say, in the UK. You could make an argument that the UK, compared to a lot of, particularly England, compared to a lot of other countries in the West, even on the continent, is the least secular one. Hence, the Queen is still the head of the Church of England. So there's still a kind of a connection between the public institutions and the private life of their people. But because of that, at least sociologically, would show that England tends to be one of the most secular two countries, fewer people going to church. Scandinavian countries are the same way. There's not a clean break in their institutions in the church, but therefore they become the most secular too. Now, my point is, when we talk about faith formation, we almost always, and this has something to do with the way my country, I think, talks about it as well, is we almost always think of it as a secular two issue. That the issue that we face in faith formation is that our young people, our older people, all of our people in our communities are not going to church as much as they used to. The church isn't able to attract them. They're not believing in the same, they're not ticking on surveys that they believe in the same percentages that they used to. So what should the church do to be able to attract them? That's almost how we always view that. And so we start to think of things like, how do we get resilient faith? And this is what I've called kind of the throwing adjectives in front of faith, is that we want a robust faith, or we want a sticky faith, or we want a vibrant faith, because we hope that it will hold in these kind of secular two tensions where people can decide to affiliate to give their time to something else. Well, this then leads us in. So Taylor says that's important. And if you work in a church, if you are even work half-time in a church, or if you are the bishop, or you're whatever you might be, that's a big deal. Like, me as a professor at a seminary, it's a huge deal. If the denomination that the seminary is part of continues to weaken, all sorts of cuts will happen, all sorts of issues will happen. Will we be able to fix roofs on churches? These become huge issues as secular two starts to set in. But Taylor's point, and why the book is 800 pages, is because he doesn't think that's really our issue. I mean, again, if you get a paycheck from a religious institution, it matters to you. But ultimately, he doesn't think that's what it means to live in a secular age. And what he thinks it means to live in a secular age is what he calls secular three. And he thinks what that is that all belief becomes contested. So belief itself becomes fragilized. That if you're someone who deeply believes, goes to church, often takes your kids to church, it will happen. It's just inevitable in this kind of environment we live in, that at some point you will kind of get crossed up, or doubt will hit you, and you'll wonder, is this really true, or is this just the family I grew up in? I mean, if I would have grown up in Central Africa, would I believe this? Or if I would have grown up in India, would I believe this? Is this really true, or is this just like an evolutionary trick? Is this just false pattern recognition? Like, you can't help be thrust into that fragilization. That's just the era we live in. But what's so fascinating about Taylor, and has kept me reading him over and over again, is he thinks that this works in two directions. So if you are someone who believes, you can't help at some point not believing. But if you're someone who doesn't believe, like listen, you went to university and, you studied genetics or something, or you just have done enough reading, and that you just know that religion is it's just a trick for powerful people to keep their power. It's just, there's no truth to it. You don't believe. What his point is that even in this kind of secular age, your belief to not believe will at some point become fragilized. That you will find yourself even believing at points. If you're a believing person, you'll find yourself fragilized, and you'll not believe at points. If you're someone who doesn't believe as your belief system, but you don't believe, at certain points you'll find that self fragilized, and you'll believe at certain points. So you'll go to that Christmas concert, and Bach will play, and something will come over you and long for you, and you'll feel something call out to you, or you'll have some very odd and yet beautiful experiences as you grieve your mother's death that seem to beckon to you. And even though you know what death is, I mean, death is just like a TV set turning off. There's nothing there. I mean, that's what you believe. Nevertheless, at some points that will become fragilized. You'll become crossed up in that belief, and you'll find yourself wondering, is there more? And so this is what he means by living in a secular age, is that you always are dealing with the fragilization of belief in the midst of this.